Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for inviting me to speak. My usual place is in the audience. 2 minutes into Jeffrey's speech, and I thought I was going to have to go and rewrite mine. But thankfully, he brought some completely new concepts and new thinking. Oscar Wilde said, "If you want to tell people the truth, make them laugh, otherwise they'll kill you." Well, it's an honor and it's refreshing to talk to an audience where that's hopefully not the issue, unless there's some politicians in the audience. In preparing my talk, I asked myself how I came to my beliefs. As a kid growing up, I'm sure you can tell in South Africa, I didn't know the meaning of terms libertarian, anarchist, free market. All I knew is that there were too many rules. I questioned everything. I didn't like the authority and control. And I certainly didn't like what the South African government was doing. I never felt they represented me or my ideals, my ethics, my morals. Most people probably do feel that way, but they go along to get along. It's just easier that way. But that does actually give hope, because I think that there's a huge amount of latent libertarian anarchists out there. It's just that they don't know it yet. Most people have pure intentions, but have little understanding of economics. This leads them to misdiagnose problems and support the wrong solutions to those problems. As they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We all want the same things, but as libertarians grounded in Austrian economics, we have a clear vision of how to get there. One of my earliest memories of contrarian thinking was as a student. I read in the local newspaper that a human rights organization called the Black Sash had successfully lobbied government to make it illegal for farmers to employ child labor. Just put this slide up. To make it illegal. Farmers were employing child labor from neighboring states to come at harvest season to come and pick potatoes. So they lobbied government that they got it made illegal. Everyone that I spoke to seemed to think that this was a good thing, that they'd done the right thing, and I disagreed with them. And I remember being angry enough to write a letter to the editor explaining that what this group had done was actually they did nothing for the kids, they actually just took away their best option. They didn't address the reasons why these kids were voluntarily getting on buses and going to pick potatoes in the scorching hot sun for 12 hours for very little pay and a little bit of food. We all dislike child labor. You look at an image like that and nobody likes that. But the problem is, simply making it illegal doesn't remove the underlying causes. So these human rights organizations let emotion, and the public in general, let emotional issues cloud the economic issues. Instead of criticizing the governments of those neighboring states for the policies that resulted in the poverty and the inability for parents to look after their children, they unintentionally punish the very children they're purporting to protect. These kids still had nothing, but now they couldn't even get on buses and go and earn a little bit of money and get a little bit of food. They were left to starve. It leads me to think that the organizations like the Black Sash are more of a human rights removal organization than anything else. I'm not an accomplished academic, and there's certainly, I don't have a PhD in economics, and there's certainly a lot smarter people in the room than what I am. My personal philosophy and my understanding comes from logic. But one thing I have learned is that you don't have to be that smart. You just have to pick your teachers properly. All you need is an open mind, critical thinking, and reason, and this will lead you to smart and truthful people. That's what led me to Austrian economics, free markets, people like Mises, Rothbard, Rockwell, Griffin, Doug Casey, Jeff Berwick, Doug French, Mark Farber. It's quite a long list. Walter Williams, and the main speaker here today, Jeffrey Tucker, to name but a few. So the topic of my talk, of my speech, is democracy is evil. It's a failed system of government. As we've heard already, there are many forms of government, and they're all evil. History is one long list of misery and suffering under oppression. Rulers have been killing people for centuries. Sometimes they killed deliberately through wars, etc., and sometimes indirectly, poverty, starvation, suicide, as we heard now, blamed on austerity, but actually directly due to government policies. Suicide, crime, gang warfare, all brought about as the unintended consequences of ignorant or intentionally dishonest policies. According to Professor Rummel, during the 20th century alone, government power was used to murder approximately 262 million people. That doesn't include the soldiers that were killed in battle, which can also be argued is a direct result of the state. That's actually one thing that governments do very efficiently, killing. Stalin said, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." At times it's foreign governments that pose a threat, but mostly it's your own government that poses the greatest threat to your well-being. Often people dismiss these atrocities, these past atrocities, and they say, that couldn't happen here, or that was in the past, it'll never happen again. But it is happening today. Somalia, Afghanistan, Syria, Egypt, the list goes on. It's actually ironic that one of the hot topics today, especially in the States, is gun control. Governments controlling the possession of guns by the people. But there's no discussion of disarming governments, the greatest killers by far, the people disarming governments. If history has one main theme, it's the struggle for freedom. People have always been ruled by one ruler or another, one form. We've had kings, monarchs, dictators, and other despotic leaders. In reality, freedom and government are mutually exclusive terms. You are either free to make your own decisions regarding your life and property, according to your own free will, or you are governed, and somebody else makes those decisions for you. Whether that somebody is a king, a ruler, or a democratically elected leader doesn't make a difference. In fact, the individual and the state are diametrically opposed, even though a lot of people see the state as our salvation. It never ceases to amaze me that you turn on the TV and most of what you hear people say is the government must do something about it. I'm sure I'm mostly preaching to the converted in this room, but the problem is most people, even if they do recognize the problems, do not recognize the real causes or the solutions. They see the inequality between the haves and the have-nots, but they misdiagnose the cause. They blame the rich, they blame capitalism, they blame the free market. They fall into the class warfare trap, which is eagerly promoted by those in power. Greed is blamed, but never the greed of the political class. In a recent interview, I'm sure most of you have seen it, the actor Russell Brand called for a revolution. So he too sees the disparity between rich and poor. But then he misdiagnoses the cause as profits. Profit is a filthy word, he says. He calls for a socialist egalitarian system. Sounds like he wants to give Marx another go. But his views are echoed by the great majority. They don't see the real cause is government through flawed policy and blatant theft. We saw this even with the Occupy movements, as well as a lot of the riots and revolutions that are going on around the world. These revolutions are really for freedom. That's what they are, both economic and political freedom. But even the protesters themselves are unclear at the real cause of the problems. They generally are not protesting to change the actual system, just the leaders, swapping one set of thugs for another. This plays right into the hands of world leaders. These events are then deceitfully described by those in power as uprisings for democracy. And the mainstream media pushes this narrative. So the blame is neatly shifted away from government per se and blamed on the type of government. If only we could spread democracy, and empower the people, everything would be fine. Most people buy this mainstream narrative. Simple truth is, we've never had real capitalism, or at least not for hundreds of years. And we've never actually had real freedom. You cannot have a centrally planned economy and have a free society. Economic freedom is a prerequisite for freedom in general. The government, central banks, and the crony capitalists they're bed with have sucked the life out of the productive class and suffocated the free market. This, and not anything else, has created the greatest disparity between rich and poor. And it is this that is responsible for most of the human suffering throughout history. This is what has greatly benefited the few at the expense of the many. But wasn't democracy supposed to fix all of this? Is it not the panacea for all bad forms of government? Hasn't the power to elect leaders changed everything? That's definitely the way it's been sold to us all. But the short answer is no. It's actually made the problem worse. Democracy does not guarantee freedom. In fact, it's probably the greatest threat to freedom. Sounds counterintuitive, but I'll explain. Democracy is peddled as being synonymous with freedom and the ideal to strive for. Spreading democracy is declared as bringing freedom to oppressed people. The truth is, all democracy provides is a facade or an illusion of freedom. And it's actually what has allowed those in power to hold on to that power. Democracy relies on a division of people. People support the actual system inadvertently by supporting one party and their policies or another. And they support them from their enemy, and their enemy is their fellow citizen. Divide and conquer. Why does democracy threaten freedom? And why does it always produce the worst results? Democracy has a number of flaws. I'll start with the smaller ones. Firstly, your voter turnout is low. In fact, in Australia, voting has become compulsory to ensure that they get the numbers to validate, and in order those that are elected can claim a mandate. Is that freedom? Should voting be compulsory? Voters are largely uninformed and they're easily manipulated because of that. This allows for powerful interests to corrupt the whole process. Why else would millions, and in the States, billions, be spent on election campaigns? The people who support those who will provide them with the most benefits. Sorry, I'll repeat that. The people will support those who provide them with the most benefits. Votes and financial support are bought with promises of increased entitlements, welfare, or promises of government contracts to be awarded. The fact is, if you steal from Peter to pay Paul, you get Paul's vote. Politicians buy votes and they sell favors. Crony capitalists buy the politicians through campaign contributions and lobbyists. Another explanation for the current enormous levels of government, and this was mentioned by one of the previous speakers, is that the unborn cannot vote. So governments can secure votes, or leaders can secure votes today with handouts that indebt future generations. The voting process is itself far from transparent. And in a world where we know that markets are heavily manipulated, surely it's not far-fetched to think that the elections could be. Propaganda, intimidation, lies, manipulation, all play their part in corrupting the process. This is a bone of contention, but whoever said it's not the votes that count, but who counts the votes, was probably right. A much more important flaw, though, of democracy is that the wrong people run for office and the worst of them get elected. What makes one successful in government is exactly the opposite of what makes you successful in the free market. In this regard, the state is the antithesis of the free market, and leaders in government are the polar opposite to natural leaders in the free market. Those that succeed and rise to powerful positions those that succeed and rise to positions of power and leadership in the free market, they do so for foresight, brilliance, creative ability. Those that rise to leadership in government, they're rewarded for totally different traits: lies, deception, bribery, corruption, and the ability to do almost anything, no matter how immoral. The world is actually upside down. There was a time when industrialists and capitalists were looked up to, they were revered. Now they are despised and seen as greedy and selfish. The blame is put squarely on them. And who do we idolize now? Political leaders, treated more like celebrities than what they really should be, servants of the people. Lord Acton once said, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men." This explains why even moral people, when they are given too much power, tend to abuse that power. But with democracy, this reality is exacerbated. Why? Because democracy allows for the competition of that power. Therefore, the prize attracts the already corrupt. They don't have to be corrupted, the worst of which get to the top. In other words, while it's possible in theory, not likely in practice, but it's possible to have a king who's moral and fair, or an authoritarian ruler, it actually cannot happen in democracy. Lew Rockwell talks about two kinds of competition and their results. I quote, "Competition in the marketplace leads to relentless improvements in quality. The enterprise that performs its job with excellence relative to others, promising similar goods and services, succeeds. The marketplace is always open to new entrants who can show the existing producers how to do the same thing better or do something else entirely. Consumers reward shrewd producers and punish the dull ones, so the best get on top. There is accountability for error, and it is punished." In politics, competitive pressures yield exactly the opposite. The quality is constantly declining. The only improvements take place in the process of doing bad things, lying, cheating, manipulating, stealing, and killing. The price of political services is constantly increasing, whether in tax dollars paid or in the bribes owed for protection, also known as campaign contributions. And he says, as Hayek famously argued, in politics, the worst get on top, and there is no accountability. The higher the office, the more criminal wrongdoing a person can get away with. So the fact is, to be democratically elected, it's almost a prerequisite to be a lying sociopath with defective character traits. These people are looking for power and control over others. Doug French explains how, according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Maslow described two types of esteem needs, a lower type and a higher type. The higher need is the need for freedom, independence, confidence, and achievement. Those traits describe free market leaders, natural leaders. The lower need is the need for status, respect of others, fame, glory, recognition, and control. These perfectly describe politicians. They seek through power that they could, what they could never achieve in the free market. This is why an honest and moral person could never win an election. In fact, probably if any of you ran for election on a platform of free markets and limited government even, who would support you? Not big business. They like legislation that protects them from competition. And who would vote for you? Not those who want increased handouts and entitlement, and that's unfortunately the majority. Yet another flaw of democracy is that it is short-term. Power is not passed. I'm not advocating going back to kings and absolute rulers, but power is not passed on to descendants. Just giving you another flaw of the democratic process. Power is not passed to descendants. Democratic leaders are there for a short time. They're short-term caretakers. There's no incentive to preserve or enhance the country. The incentive is to maximize their exploitation. They use temporary government power to their own advantage. The reason being, what they don't use, they lose. So make hay while the sun shines. Longer-term health or damage to the country, it's not a priority. But the greatest danger of democracy, by far, is the fallacy of democracy, the belief that democracy guarantees freedom. Because this is the great enabler. This is such widespread acceptance that this is what has facilitated the continuation of control and tyranny through the last 100 years, 200 years. The definition of democracy is government by the people in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised directly by them or by their elected agents under a free electoral system. Or as Abraham Lincoln put it, democracy is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. This is the common understanding, but I think a more accurate definition would be government of the people, by democratically appointed dictators, for elite and politically connected. At best, democracy is mob rule, limited only by what the leaders determine is not within their scope, which turns out over time to be not really much at all. At worst, and in reality, it is a smokescreen for an authoritarian regime that does not protect rights and natural laws, but violates rights and enforces its own laws. Democratic regimes necessarily result in tyranny of the majority, a majority that is easily manipulated by the elites. Edward Moreau said, "A nation of sheep will beget a government of wolves." Well, the wool has been pulled securely over our eyes, and the support for democracy in the widespread media and people is completely unquestioned. Even if the process weren't that corrupt, and it was truly representative, it's still majority rule, which is basically nothing more than mob rule if your individual rights are trampled. Democracy is a form of collectivism. Individual rights are sacrificed to the majority. It's an immoral position to argue that because the majority agreed to a certain thing, whatever action it might be, say a war, everyone is coerced accordingly. Not only even if you're opposed to it. So not only are you forced to comply, but you're even forced to finance it. Taken to the extreme, the majority could vote your life away. Pretty much everyone would agree that would be unacceptable. But even though the same principle applies, voting your property away seems to be fine with most people. It's done for the greater good, or in the interest of national security, one of my favorites. The bottom line is, if I'm prohibited from doing something which I want to do, that is a loss of my liberty. It doesn't matter if the person limiting my freedom came to power by right of birth or by conquest or in a free and fair election. My freedom is gone. The only difference, and this is the big difference, is that under democracy, it's somehow acceptable because it's the will of the people. With a king or dictator, oppression often leads to revolution. But with democracy, because it's the will of the people, any loss of liberty has a tacit approval. Leaders use democracy to justify whatever they want to do. And seeing as you elected the government, not only are you responsible for, but you are bound by what they do. And if you don't like it, you're told, vote for somebody else. Is that any solution? There's always someone else promising change. That's what Obama promised. And there always is change. It gets worse. It doesn't matter how an individual government comes to power. What matters is the power that they have. If they have the power to limit your liberty and freedom, it doesn't matter how they came in. It doesn't matter if a majority elected them. It doesn't matter if it's a free and fair election. You would never accept a majority telling you what religion to follow or whom you can marry. But actually we do. Taken to the extreme, if I needed a kidney, am I entitled to one of yours? What if the majority says I am? Surely if it's for the greater good of society, sacrificing one individual to harvest their organs for the benefit of many individuals, surely that's acceptable? No, and if it's not acceptable for one individual to do it, then it shouldn't be acceptable for a group to do it, no matter if they are the majority in a democratic process. So, should the views and morals of the majority limit any of your freedoms to follow your own views and morals? We see this loss of liberty every single day. Every new law and regulation reinforces it. The fundamental conflict here is between individualism and collectivism. Does an individual's life belong to him, or does it belong to society or the state? Under a democracy, it's possible to vote all your rights away, and that's what's largely been done. Democracy has diverted the focus of the people. As we heard from Jeffrey's speech, the focus should be debating the legitimate function of government, if any. The focus should not be on how the government comes to power. And democracy is seen as the best form. Through the illusion of democracy, people are promised liberation from tyranny, only to be subjected to the tyranny of the majority. Democracy serves to mask the reality of elite rule. And so instead of blatant oppression that we had before, we get shadowy manipulation and corruption. I hear people saying, and friends of mine, yeah, democracy has its flaws, but there's no better option. It's the best form of government. Besides, what do you think we should have? Have you got a better option? It's not popular, but I say, yeah, no government. In fact, I'll quote Benjamin Marx, as he always says, no government is better than democracy. But the question is, do we need to be governed? Why is it that we're not considered competent to decide how to run our own lives, yet we are competent to elect the leaders that tell us how to run our lives? Doesn't seem logical to me. If there is even one legitimate function of government, and I personally don't believe there is, but if there was one legitimate function of government, it would be to protect your existing rights, your existing individual rights and freedoms, nothing more. But as we heard before, you can never limit that. Unfortunately, government by its nature cannot be limited. It's like a cancer that spreads into every aspect of our lives. It becomes more a violator than a protector of those rights. Freedom and control are mutually exclusive. Democracy is just another form of control. Even when the intention is to limit those powers, like we saw in the birth of America, to maintain a level of individual freedoms, those limitations are eroded over time, and more regulations come to be. Regulations get built over 100 years. Laws restrict your freedoms until there's so many regulations and so little freedoms that you're reduced to a nation of criminals and slaves. Democracy has actually enabled this growth, and at no point in time has the majority been so uninformed about the real issues. We know a lot about Australian Idol, X Factor, Big Brother, and much more about the lives of celebrities than we know about what is vital to our own lives. Constantly surprises me how much faith people still have in governments and the political process. The truth is, governments all over the world have completely wrecked the global economy with their policies and corruption. And until people start to wake up, this is going to continue. To conclude, there are two ways for people to interact, voluntarily or by force. The question you need to ask yourself, do you believe in freedom or slavery? Because all government is a form of slavery. No system of governance provides a better environment for progress than the free market does. Throughout history, people have been ruled by some form of ruler or another. It's always resulted in the few benefiting enormously at the expense of many. Democracy provides an illusion of self-rule, but in reality, it's nothing more than the perpetuation of control. Democracy is the great enabler of this process, as it can be said to be the will of the people. Democracy has provided moral camouflage for sociopathic political animals to take more and more control, smother the free markets and the productive class. Democracy has allowed immoral outcomes to be justified as the will of the majority and has led to the crony capitalist system that we have today. We cannot rely on political solutions for this because the machine cannot be changed. We need to find a new approach. Limiting government power is ineffective. They always grant themselves more power and create new regulations. It's time for people to think for themselves, open their eyes to the true causes of misery and suffering, the state itself. And that this is perpetuated and validated by democracy. What we need is freedom. What we need is freedom and liberty, not democracy. We need to withdraw the consent of the governed, instead of blindly following like sheep. There can be no political solution. You will never change it. The only way to get real change is to change the mind of individuals. Take a room like this, for example. It's fantastic to see, but it's still a very small minority. It's a slow process, but it will happen. Steve Biko, he was an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa, once said, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." I'll leave you with two quotes from Lenin, which sum up this predicament perfectly. The first quote is, "Our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. I think we're being run by maniacs for maniacal ends, and I think I'm liable to be put away as insane for expressing that. That's what's insane about it." I realize this view is not the popular view, and it definitely doesn't go down well at dinner parties. But as Lenin said, being honest may not get you many friends, but it'll always get you the right ones. I think I'm amongst friends here today. Thank you.
I just wanted to add a quick example about that. PayPal is an international payment system that does dispute resolution. There's no government involved there.
Correct.
Obviously, they're very crude, they're very harsh, but ultimately, if I have an issue with someone in China, there's no government required to resolve that. So in something like business, I think there'll be a lot of other systems. Criminal's a bit harder, but Bob Murphy has a video online. I can't remember what it's called exactly, so I might be able to help me out with that. But I think it's just free market legal systems or free market law.
Yeah, you know, I often get questions because I've got pretty harsh views on all of this. So I often get questions. Okay, so the typical one, obviously, who would build the roads? But and I get that question. Trust me. But my first answer to that is that, firstly, the same people that build the roads today would be building the roads. because
I'm not arguing that. I'm just arguing that you need to have
some sort of administration.
Yes, and there's
I think the free market is perfectly capable of administering itself. Exactly like the point there with PayPal. People will find ways, find methods, and I don't know what they are. That's the beauty of the free market, is there's so much development. 20 years ago, no one would have imagined what was going to happen with mobile communications, etc. That's the beauty with the free market. Who knows how it's going to evolve? Who knows how these things would... PayPal, no one would have known how PayPal would be getting involved in disputes resolution and how they would handle that. But the free market handles all of that. The thing is, if you just take government out of it, we get all these innovations. And
I'm sorry, we'll have to stop there for questions. Would you join me in thanking Roy?
Thank you.